Kia ora, everybody, and back to the second session here. And just a reminder that there is another parallel session happening on the programme online. So it is okay to sort of jump out and join the video stream and have a watch of the other ones online and come in and out and see different presentations. And that all of them will be recorded. So you'll be able to get access to the recordings you couldn't see run live. So next session, we have another group of students from both the Office of Sustainability and also from Food Waste Innovation. So we have Bethany, who's been looking at EVs, and Te Whātua ora here in Dunedin. We have Tessa, who's been looking at the mobile library service here in Dunedin. We have got Brooke, who's been looking at student air travel emissions. And we'll get Elena, who's been looking at food waste and aged care. And just a reminder, we'll do 15 minutes each. I'll be popping up the timer. Hopefully I can get the timer right this time and I can work it which way the time goes up or down. Unless you've asked me not to do that, and then that's fine. And then we'll have a question time after. And then we'll break for some lunch. Over to you.
Hello everyone, I'm Bethany. I'm an energy management student, and this summer I got to work with Te Whātua Southern. They wanted to see how changing the 300 fleet vehicles over to EVs would affect emissions and costs. So first I started with a literature review. So from the figure here, which was from the New Zealand Greenhouse Gas Inventory for 2021, they found in their breakdown of emissions that 16.5% of emissions was from road transport, which was about 6,000 kilotons of CO2 equivalent just by light road transport vehicles in New Zealand. And so if we as New Zealand, we want to reduce this to be able to get to net zero by 2050 for the Paris Agreement. And one way to do this, I found in a 2021 report that they did a study in New Zealand about the cost and emissions comparison for electric vehicles and petrol vehicles. And they found that by changing from petrol to electric, we could save about 87 to 90% in emissions. So for our main questions, we were mainly looking at the emissions and costs reduction. And so to start with, we looked at Wākari, as Wākari has about 70 vehicles in their fleet, petrol vehicles. And so from there, I was able to scale this to the whole 300 fleet vehicles across Te Whātua Southern. And then lastly, we wanted to look at what time of day is the best for them to be charging, because as the rates depend on the time of day, we wanted to look at what time of day would be cheapest to charge, but also avoiding the peak times for power usage to avoid overloading the grid, and also to avoid those congestion period charges. So to do this, I needed to make some assumptions in order to be able to do the calculations in the 10-week period. And so our first one was that the EVs would only be charged at the hospitals. This is most likely true in a real case, as they would be mainly charging at the hospitals, but as they do long distance travel for day trips to like Invercargill and Queenstown, they are most likely going to have to do extra charges on the way. And to be able to do my calculations, I used the fuel economies for the vehicles. So I was given the petrol invoices, and so using the fuel economies, I was able to find a rough distance that they had been traveling. The fuel economies are based on a test which is standardized, and so that has standard weather conditions, terrain, and driving style. So it's not exact, but it would give a rough idea. And so then to scale it to the 300 vehicles, I needed to separate the vehicles into larger and smaller, as there was a lot of different models. And so I separated it to the ones that are larger, like the RAV4s, and smaller, like the Corollas, and used those fuel economies to be able to find the distances and electricity needed. And then we needed to account for energy losses through the charging. So batteries have a resistance, and so the power that you put through to charge the battery isn't all going to be accepted by the battery. So next I have my method. So I needed to choose 2 electric vehicles to replace the current petrol vehicles. So I chose the BYD 803 to replace the RAV4 and the Hyundai Ioniq Series 2 to replace the Toyota Corolla. And these 2 vehicles are ones that Whakarī Hospital already has, and so it would be easier for the staff to transition over to these vehicles. And next I need to find the amount of electricity needed for the same travel, which, as I said before, I used the fuel economies in order to do this. And then from there, I was able to calculate emissions. And so I used the Ministry for the Environment's Guide for Organisations, which gave me the emissions factors for both fuel and the electricity from the grid. And then calculating the cost, I used the rates per month, which had the different times. And so I just took an average of the times and was able to calculate the cost of electricity. And I had the cost of petrol from the fuel invoices. And then to expand to the whole fleet, I did, as I said before, I separated into the larger and smaller vehicles, and then I was able to use the same method in order to find the emissions and costs. And then for the best times to charge, I took the rates for each of those times and the amount of electricity needed per month and totaled all of it for just if they were going to charge between, say, midnight and 4 a.m. And then I divided it by the number of days in that 10-month period. So here in this figure, we have the Whakarī travel emissions for 70 vehicles. So in the blue, we have petrol vehicles, and in the red, we have electric vehicles. And we can see that I calculated that it was about 86 to 89% savings in emissions, which agrees with the literature, which had 87 to 90% savings. And we can see that it looks like in August, they had a bit of a jump in emissions, but that is most likely due to the fact that I had the November fleet list. And so in the January through to July months, they would have had other vehicles that had transitioned out, so were no longer on that fleet list. And next we have the travel costs for Whakarī. So I found that they would get a 82 to 89% cost savings, and the figure's still the same with petrol vehicles in blue, EVs in red, and we can see it still has the same sort of flow. So then next, for the whole fleet of about 300 vehicles, so I found there to be a 86 to 88% savings in emissions. And we can see that from the figure that May was the most emitting month, which could be interesting for Whakarī to look at, like, or look to Whātu Ora to look at, to see why did we travel that much that month? Why did we not travel much in April? Some statistical things. And then for the travel costs, I found an 81 to 89% cost savings. And yeah, another thing to note with this graph, it looks like they spent more in August, but they traveled more in May. But the reason for that is the fuel tax coming back in July. And so then for the charging plan, so I have blue as the weekdays and red as the weekend days, because I have different prices for the weekend and weekday. And then the pink bar across is if they were to charge at an average of all of the times. So it's pretty much just an average of all of these bars. And so we can see from this figure that the best time for them to charge is between midnight and 8 a.m., which is good because these times avoid the main peak times for the grid, and also would avoid the usual congestion period times. But a thought for this is, how would we implement a charging plan like this from midnight to 8 a.m. when nobody really wants to be up at midnight plugging in vehicles? So this is where I found out about smart charging. So with smart charging, you can set on the interface a time for it to turn on and off. So you're not having to be up at midnight plugging them in. You can just plug them in during the day and set the times for them to turn on. And with this, you can also have the max power. So with this EV charging station in the figure, it has a max power of 50 kilowatts, and it will spread out the charge between all of the vehicles that are plugged in. So if you have this case of 3 vehicles, it will spread it out evenly between them, so about 16 kilowatts each. And then once one vehicle has finished charging its full battery, then it will stop sending any power to that vehicle and just spread out the charge between the 2 vehicles, and so on until all of the vehicles are charged. And we can also have the set amount of power for it, so you do not go over the transformer capacity, because we don't want to overload anything. It's not fun. And another thing to think about with vehicles is the embodied emissions. So in this study, we were mainly looking at the driving emissions for Te Whatu Ora Southern, because that's what they're going to be using them for. But in reality, there's also emissions from the production of the vehicle to the end use. So from this figure, which is from a New Zealand study on the life cycle of electric vehicles, we can see that up top, the petrol vehicle, the main part of emissions is from just driving. And for the bottom one, the battery ones here, it's quite small, which agrees with what I found of about 80 to 90% reduction. Another thing to look at is the production. So the first couple of bars here before the green is the production. And so for EVs, the main source of emissions from production is from the batteries, which causes it to have more emissions in the production phase than a petrol vehicle. However, over the whole life cycle, we would see that electric vehicles in New Zealand would produce a lot less emissions. So some conclusions. So we wanted to find out the cost and emissions decrease. So we found it to be about 80 to 90%, which is great. And then also finding a charging plan, which talked about smart charging, which would be cool for them to look into. And yeah, so some future research ideas. So you're looking into smart charging and how it could work for all of the different hospitals across Te Whatu Ora Southern, but also maybe expanding to all of Te Whatu Ora's fleet across New Zealand and seeing how it would work for all of the hospitals across there, seeing how the emissions could decrease for each hospital across New Zealand. So, thank you.
Okay, this is opportunities for Dunedin's mobile library and emissions and social sustainability perspective. Tēnā koutou katoa, no tamaki makaurau ahau, ke oti poti tōku kāinga inaine, ko Worthington tōku whānau, ko Tessa tōku ingoa, ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei, ka mihi hoki au ki ngā tohu o te rohi nei, Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So hi everyone, my name is Tessa Worthington and I'm going into my 4th year of a Bachelor of Arts in Science in Genetics and Psychology. But I have many passions. I love to be outdoors, I enjoy thinking about sustainability, and I'm passionate about building strong communities. So a little bit of background on the project. There are a few things that contributed. Dunedin Public Libraries currently have 2 book buses, they are mobile libraries. They have 1 electric and 1 diesel powered, and they travel around to set stops every week, deliver books. They visit events around the city, they go to the AMP show, they go to Wild Dunedin events, that kind of thing. They're extremely valued assets in the wider Dunedin community, which was something new to me, something really exciting to see. In September 2023, the Dunedin City Council also adopted the Zero Carbon Plan 2030, which is a plan to make Dunedin a net carbon zero city, and this project was born out of that adoption. In 2017, Dunedin Public Libraries also conducted a mobile library services survey where they went around and they surveyed over 700 people and found out what was valued about the mobile library services, and they received hundreds and hundreds of comments about how valued the service was, and they had a 97% satisfaction rate. And then finally, Dunedin Public Libraries currently does youth outreach only, and they're looking for opportunities to expand. So this project was formed out of all of these things and expanding on these things, and the pitch became, this project is an investigation into a replacement for the second Dunedin City Council book bus to an EV and wider social and environmental sustainability impacts and opportunities available. So what are emissions, why are they bad, and why do we talk about carbon dioxide so much? So emissions are substances that are released into the atmosphere, they trap heat, they warm the earth up, that's why they're called a greenhouse gas, because they act like a greenhouse. And this results in climate change, which, as you all know, has far-reaching and catastrophic consequences, rising sea levels, extreme weather, etc., etc. And carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas. It's responsible for about 3/4 of emissions, and it's the main greenhouse gas produced by vehicles. And then social sustainability is a process that it's a process about creating sustainable, successful communities that promote well-being by understanding what people need from the places that they live and they work. Socially sustainable communities they're equitable, diverse, connected, democratic, and provide a good quality of life. Why are they important? Because everyone deserves to live healthy, happy lives, and communities are going to need more support and stay strong as the climate changes. So for this project, I had a few different research methods. I had the book bus survey, where I went onto the book bus, hung out for a few days, talked to lots of the patrons, which was conducted in December during weekdays, normal working hours, and that had 90 participants. And then I also did a city library survey, went to the city library near the Octagon, conducted in January, and again, weekdays, normal working hours, and that had 89 participants. On the book bus survey and the city library survey, patrons were surveyed on their mode of transport, parking, travel distance, trip chaining, other services they might be interested in, and their demographics. The city library survey had those things as well, plus whether they use the book bus or not, and whether additional services would change the usage of the book bus. I also conducted interviews with mobile library managers around Aotearoa, specifically Wellington, Auckland, Christchurch City Libraries, and Napier Libraries, and they were questioned about the services that they offered, challenges they faced, reporting and evaluating their services, and questions specific to their mobile library setup. I also did quite a bit of online research for libraries Aotearoa and worldwide. And I was looking for things that were different that people were doing, interesting things, and also different forms of mobile libraries other than buses and vans that could be relevant to Ōtepoti Dunedin, and there's a pretty cool one that you'll see at the end of the presentation. Cool, so I was going to start off with some emissions related results. So I've kind of split my results into emissions related and then social sustainability related. So this one is comparing the book bus and city library surveys. So for mode of transport, 69% of the book bus sample used a sustainable form of transport, which is walking, biking, busing, using a battery electric or hybrid vehicle. And then 40% of the city library sample used a sustainable form of transport. as meaning that 60% used a petrol vehicle. And then for distance travelled, 84% of the book bus sample travelled under 2 kilometres to the book bus, whereas only 13% of the city library sample travelled under 2 kilometres. There was a much wider spread. People are coming from all over the wider area to get to the city library. And that is quite important to acknowledge why that is. People are coming to the city library often for a different purpose to the book bus, which came quite apparent to me. People like, I'm coming to the city library for its gigantic collections and to the events and that kind of stuff. So that's important to keep in mind. We also looked at trip chaining. Trip chaining is defined as grouping errands or other activities into one trip instead of returning home in between each one, something that we all naturally do, but it is quite important when thinking about living sustainably. So 52% of the book bus sample trip chained and 82% of the city library sample trip chained, which makes sense. You go into town, do your errands. And there's a bit of nuance here because trip chaining is potentially less important if the distance is so short, like with the book bus, where most of the samples only going 2 kilometres and most of them were actually walking. So yeah, so from these results, my conclusions were that journeys to the book bus are short and often use sustainable forms of transport. And however, city library users are trip chaining more. So it's important to know about, because we can replace the diesel bus so the City Council currently has a diesel bus and an electric bus. We could replace the diesel bus with another electric vehicle, which would reduce emissions, but it's also important to think about the emissions of the consumer and how they're getting there. So that's why these results are important. Cool, so I'll move on to some social sustainability related results from the book bus and city library surveys. So participants were asked what services they would be interested in a new book bus providing, and the interest was quite similar across both of the surveys, so I just averaged the results. And so you can see up here the categories. So we had like pop-up library services, visiting beaches, events, parks around Dunedin, that kind of thing, visiting more community facilities like aged care facilities, schools, preschools, marae, etc. Workshops and talks, could be on gardening, parenting, history, local author visits, etc. Community visits, community services such as local and central government election, justice of peace services, helping with setting up low-cost internet and information about support services, and finally council-related services and information, payments, community consultation, dog registration, that sort of thing. So they were interested in all of that, and we can see that it's not super high interest. There's definitely some interest there, but it's not super high. One thing that I think is really key to remember when looking at these statistics is that a lot of the patrons mentioned to me that they were really worried that having all of this would make the librarians really stressed out, and so that may be affecting the results here. And so it's key to just keep that in mind. And finally, in the City Library survey, participants were also asked whether the aforementioned services would change their usage of the book bus. So 46% of participants said it would increase their book bus use somewhat. 16% said that it would increase their use of the book bus significantly. However, 79% said that their use of the City Library wouldn't change, which, as I mentioned before, is because people go to the City Library for a different reason. So my conclusions from this were that there is interest in additional services, and this could definitely result in increased usage of the book bus. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some social sustainability related results, but this time from my interviews with mobile library managers and online research. And this is a part of the project that I really enjoyed. It was actually fascinating to hear about what's going on around Aotearoa. So I've got 6 kind of themes and comments, and I have so much data on this, and this is just a selection of points that I find quite interesting. So first of all, we've got all the different services that are offered. So for meeting need in the community, some mobile libraries go to drug and alcohol dependency units or drug rehabilitation, because often they can't leave, and so therefore they can't go to a library. And so they'll go there. Also going to special needs facilities, where going to a library would be way too overwhelming or just impossible for some families, which I thought was pretty cool. We've got events and pop-up libraries, so visiting parks, other events. So one library did like a collaboration with a dog rescue thing, and they brought dogs along, and then children could read with the dogs, and it was like Adopt a Dog Day, which I thought was super cool. We've got disaster and response work. So in Napier and in Auckland during the floods in Napier, they went out to provide internet access during the floods, and all the Auckland vans went to Muriwai to take withdrawn books and run story times for families. That's pretty cool. And then in terms of other big themes, we've got finding need and consultation. Some mobile libraries surveyed their communities by going to busy places like Mitre 10 Countdown, sitting outside, having big jars with pebbles and going, what do you want from your mobile library? Which I thought was quite a cool way to do it. We've also got evaluating and measuring impact. Some libraries have done documentation of stories of impact, because it's not all about a numbers game. And a quote from one librarian that I thought was really valuable was that if you're changing one kid's trajectory, you're changing a whole, there's so many flow-on effects. So it's not just about how many books are issued, it's about that holistic perspective, which I thought was really cool. We've also got themes on staffing. One mobile library manager said it's all about the staffing in terms of the services you can provide. So that's something key to take away. Also comments about vans rather than buses. They're easy to maneuver. They don't need specific licenses. They're easy to park. And then also challenges. All of them mentioned challenges. There's always challenges when doing something new, but a couple mentioned that it's transparency is really key when changing. The key theme across all of the interviews was just trying to reach those who can't reach us, and finding the need out there. Yeah. Another interesting finding, which I will quickly go over, is a book bike in Aotearoa. So Wellington City Libraries, they don't have a mobile library, but they used to have this, and it used to go along the waterfront, go to events, hand out withdrawn books. And it really piqued my interest because obviously cycling is a form of sustainable transport, and also giving those withdrawn books a second life, which I thought was really cool. This is one in Sweden, which I think is even cooler. And they have these hammocks that like pop out of there, and then kids can lie in them, and they have bring VR with them along, and iPads, and obviously books as well, which I thought was real cool. I thought these would be really cool once George Street is finished in summer. Finally, I'm just going to go through my challenges and limitations and also my recommendations. So one big challenge was assessing latent demand, finding the need in the communities that is out there, because people in the Mobile Library Services Survey in 2017, they were really happy, which is great, but they don't know what they're missing out on. And also finding need that we can't access easily. So, and then also the times and days surveyed weren't ideal, middle of summer during the work week as well. Finally, my recommendations and next steps to the Dunedin City Council and also to Dunedin Public Libraries is attempting to assess the latent demand. So going out into the community, doing that community consultation, finding groups that are interested in collaborating, and as well as that, doing stuff like maybe going into Mitre 10 Countdown, that kind of thing, and doing those jars, that kind of stuff. And then also a key one was looking into external funding. Some mobile libraries in New Zealand have been funded externally by Rotary International, by the Cotton On Foundation. So that's definitely a good option, as obviously money is pretty tight at councils at the moment. Also investigating electric vans, that's from an emissions perspective, and also they're just easier to maneuver, all of the stuff mentioned earlier. And finally, considering restructuring. A lot of mobile libraries in New Zealand, they are run as community engagement and as outreach rather than purely delivering books, and I think that would be a really valuable asset to Dunedin's community, is going further with that. Currently the mobile is very pressured for staff, which makes it really hard to go and do these extra things, and that's why I think some restructuring could be really valuable. They only really have a youth outreach team at the moment, and I think going further on that is a great idea. Finally, I'd just like to do some acknowledgements. Hold on. To Craig and Bray, my supervisors, for their support, guidance and expertise when I was feeling lost, and for widening my eyes to the many, many sustainability initiatives out there, to Mairi for doing all of the admin, thanks to the girlies in the office for motivating me to go in, for the yarns, for reading things I was unsure about, to the Dunedin City Council and Hamish for funding this project, giving me the opportunity to grow and acquire new skills and knowledge, To the team I worked with at Dunedin Public Libraries, Helena, Lynn, Anne-Marie, and Irene for your welcoming nature and support with my surveys, and to all my friends and family for your continual love and guidance. Kia ora and ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, my name is Brooke. I'm a third-year student here at the University of Otago studying politics, sustainable business and environmental management. I've had the pleasure of spending this past summer working with the Sustainability Office on a project focused on reducing student travel emissions. So this all starts with the fact that transport is one of the biggest causes of emissions nationally, and this reflects in the Otago region and the Dunedin city emissions profiles as well. And something that's really specific to Dunedin and the university's profile additionally is the fact that around 85% of students do not consider Otago or Dunedin to be their hometown. And so this creates a lot of travel and a lot of emissions as students go home, they travel for events and over across the university calendar. So the intention with this report was to really look at ways where students could be supported in making more sustainable travel decisions and how that could be reduced. So I started with this theoretical framework, which really looks at how people can be supported and their behaviours can be influenced to change their transport modes and I guess make it more sustainable overall. The three main takeaways is that people need the motivation, capability and opportunity to do so to make these changes. And so the intention is to create a report and do research into how students can be provided with these three factors to reduce these emissions and create these behavioural changes. So the train. When I sat down to do this research, something that really stood out to me significantly was this concept of the train. So in 2002, the Southerner Passenger Rail, which ran between Christchurch and Invercargill on a regular schedule, ceased its operation. And since then, there's been no equivalent service reintroduced. However, there's been wavering conversation on the possibility of a reintroduction of a service like this. And specifically in the past year, the Sustainability Office and the university have been looking at the opportunity of some form of service, some form of passenger rail for students in this realm. So I was really looking to build on this research and further that through this lens. So the question I posed was, how can an event-specific train to and from Dunedin be utilised to reduce the emissions created by students' travel behaviour, and what other benefits could this deliver for students in Dunedin? There are two aspects to the scope in question which I'll speak on. One specifically is the event-specific aspect of this question, and that really was looking to focus on the fact that there is fluctuating demand for transport in and out of Dunedin, and this is based around the university calendar, as students are a huge source of these specific travel emissions. So this looked to meet students when they are intending to travel, right, to run it at a time when there is more travel. Speaking on the intercity service, which runs in and out of Dunedin, at times of travel around the university calendar, sometimes they may increase their capability of service by 5 times. And that's just at one departure time, maybe after exams, when there's an extreme level of transport. So this was really looking to address the fact that this demand is wavering and the fact that there may not be demand at other times a year. Additionally, I focused specifically on the route between Dunedin and Christchurch for forms of transport and specifically for the service. Originally, or specifically because there is already that existing infrastructure of running the service, and also because Christchurch is the main city of in the South Island, so there is that demand, there is that high level of travel there, and there's really not the technology at this point in time that could be specifically competitive in talking about the time it would take to travel or the cost it would take to run it any further north than Christchurch. So the method I took in this research was to really look at qualitative conversations and creating that data. I wanted to gauge perspectives and opinions and understandings from the community around it and the stakeholders around transport in Dunedin and this concept of the train. As I felt this was how I could best answer my question, I identified stakeholders, and there were three main groups of stakeholders that I spoke to. So the first group of stakeholders that I spoke to were people who had some form of direct role with facilitating transport in the Dunedin area, whether that be a role in the council or a role in an organisation that had something to do with transport in Dunedin. The second group that I identified and spoke to as stakeholders were students. And whilst this is not the conversations I had and the interviews I took were not meant to be representative of the entire student body, the idea was to gauge a student perspective to round out my research and have that in the data. And thirdly, I spoke to people who had a deep background or understanding in transport, and that was a larger way to round out my data and enhance my understanding of how transport operated. So I conducted these interviews. I then transcribed and converted these interviews into data, where I then pulled out the main themes within these interviews. And the intention really was to gauge the climate for transport in Dunedin and assess where people were at and what the opinions were in the area. So there are three categories of my findings that I will discuss with you. The first being the benefits, the second being the barriers, and the third being this idea of further supporting other services or the bus service, which this was an emerging theme that developed throughout my research. So the benefits. There are two main categories of benefits for the service, with the main and possibly the most obvious one being emissions reduction. Travel by a train is significantly less emissions than travel by plane or even by car. And so that was a really strong benefit of introducing a service like this. Secondly, there was this really strong idea of connection, what it looks like to connect two cities, what it looks like to connect people during the service. So looking at the service as the train as a place to hold an event and running the train like an event, and what that looks like to connect students and people alongside it. And finally, looking at connecting this train service with other additional wider community events and services. So looking at the idea of connecting it with concerts or with sports games, and what that could look like, how that could look like, possibly being a form of subsidization for further cheaper student transport, and all of that. So looking at the barriers, there are two main categories of barriers, of themes that were discussed in these interviews, and I've separated them out into barriers on an operational basis and barriers that may affect patronage and engagement. So by far, the barrier that was discussed the most was funding. So this is to how and to what extent this service could be funded, where this funding could be accessed. The underlying all of this is the need to price it for students. So obviously students are running on maybe a slightly tighter budget than the rest of us. And so the need to not price them out of this service when this service is intended for them is very strong. And this idea of how much of the cost of operating it can you pass on to the consumer. And going back to the framework of engagement, how the cost of a service may deter someone's motivation to make that change. The second is access to rolling stock. And this is quite strong of I guess, an issue to discuss, especially when looking at the intended rolling stock is currently Dunedin Railways. And during times of really high student travel, so that's in the month of February, where people are returning back into the city for the beginning of the study year, there is also high tourism and cruise ships at that time. So the rolling stock is really limited availability, and that can really, that poses a real effect to how this service could be conducted. So from this, there is a really strong opportunity I see to run the service throughout other times of the year. When there are other events, there are other strong patterns of travel that can be identified and run, and really helping people to switch that behaviour over through those times. Additionally, infrastructure. So there are two aspects to this. One is accessing a driver with the track knowledge to run the trip. And so drivers have to have a really deep understanding of the track they're running in order to run the train. And so it's accessing originally someone who already has that track knowledge and then training the drivers up to access that. Additionally, the infrastructure, there are some areas along the track, specifically in the Timaru area, which become inundated sometimes, and that means it may be unavailable at certain times to use. And that is a really strong barrier when you're looking at creating trust and faith in a service for people to use. If people are depending on the service to get from A to B to the place they intend to go, and there's delays, that is a really strong barrier of engagement and also just operating it to begin with. So moving forward, looking at barriers to patronage and engagement. So one of the widest themes and barriers which was discussed in this interview that was also personally surprising to me was this idea of storage. So when students are traveling over breaks, they tend to take a lot with them, especially if you're going away for weeks or months at a time. So they tend to have, large amount of bags to take with them. However, the rolling stock that's intended, it was discussed that more than a single carry-on bag would be too, there would not be the capacity for people to take more than a single carry-on bag. So that poses a barrier of engagement. If people are unable to take their luggage or their storage with them, then they're going to be deterred from switching to the service. Additionally, looking at the last mile. So the last mile speaks to how someone gets from sort of getting off their mode of transport to their final destination. And something which exacerbates this in this service is the fact that in order to get further than Rolleston, which is a 25-minute drive out of Christchurch, there would need to be a Kiwi Rail guide on the train with the original driver. So that poses a barrier where there either needs to be extra funding there for that to happen, or there needs to be an additional way to help support students get from that out of town into the part of Christchurch they would like to access. And then finally, looking at travel duration. So train travel is on paper longer than driving or flying. And the duration of a trip is a real barrier to engagement for people, as it's how they view their time, how they view their experience. And I think there's a real opportunity here to combat this by providing a really positive, really engaging experience during the travel, and really how you disseminate this through the service. So finally, there was this really strong theme of supporting a bus service throughout this research. At the moment, the Intercity runs 13 times a week, roughly, between Dunedin and Christchurch. There is a really strong student customer base, and their travel is very seasonal, based around university dates already. However, when interviewing students, there was a real indication that there's a reluctance, or maybe they're not as keen to use the service due to the comfort and trip duration factors and how they view the service. So I think there is part of this research, it came out very strongly that there is an opportunity to further support the service to help increase student engagement, and this idea of supporting the service for a more regular form of sustainable transport, while also facilitating this irregular train service around events to help meet that demand. Yeah, so thank you for listening.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Elena toku ikoa. Today I'm actually presenting on my master's research, Understanding Food Waste Within Aged Care, a Systematic Review. And I've been working on this alongside Paula O'Kane from the Management Department and Miranda Morosa from Food Science, who many of you know. So food waste globally is a significant issue. It's estimated that about 1/3 of all food produced is wasted, which equates to about 1.3 billion tons of food waste every year. And simultaneously, the world also has an aging population who are also living longer than they ever have before. So it's estimated that the number of people over the age of 85 is going to double in the next 40 years. So it's reasonable to expect that there will be an increasing demand for aged care facilities moving into the future. Interestingly, aged care facilities sit at this intersection of healthcare and hospitality sectors. These are two sectors that have really high potential for food waste reduction. It's actually been reported that for aged care facilities, that they waste between 20 and 36% of all food that's produced. So that makes it one of the highest producing highest waste producing facilities in both the healthcare and the hospitality sector. So for this research, we really wanted to understand what is the landscape of food waste within aged care as it currently exists within literature. So we decided to conduct a systematic literature review, as this is a form of research that really enables you to cast that broad net, capture all of that existing research, and then synthesize it to understand what is there. And so there also hasn't been one, as far as we know, hasn't been one done. And so we had 4 research questions, and I'm mostly going to talk about 1 and 2 and touch on 3. But so how is food waste understood within the aged care? How is it being responded to? What are the unique challenges for the sector, and what are the existing gaps in research? So for the systematic literature review, we had to create a search protocol. And so up on here, we've got a couple of definitions, and they helped us understand what is the research that we're actually wanting to look to include. And so we decided that we would include all studies that included food waste within an aged care facility within the scope of the study. We chose to exclude studies that looked at plate waste used as a tool for caloric or nutritional intake of residents. We also excluded studies in hospitals and individual or old people living independently. So we searched across 5 databases, which generated 331 results that were screened by title and abstract. Of these, we read 23 in full text and selected 8 to include in our final data set. Those 8 studies, we then did citation screening on. So we did forwards, backwards, and sideways citation screening to look for further relevant studies. And this gave us an additional 6 studies. So the total number of studies in the data set was 14. And so that's the process that we went through there. For data analysis, we used inductive and iterative approach to identify codes and patterns within the data set. And then for the data synthesis, we used a narrative synthesis approach. So up on the screen here is just some visual representations of the different models and processes that our thinking went through over that process. And it ends with a conceptual model, which is made a bit more shiny here for you. But essentially, this conceptual model allows us to understand who the different actors are within this aged care landscape, what the processes are, and how they interact as it relates to food waste. So at the top, you have the aged care organization. And so these organizations, they provide housing and care for residents, they provide employment for staff, and they define the processes that staff engage in to provide food service for their residents. And at this level, we can see that organizational culture and strategy, HR practices, and that physical infrastructure of the facility all influence how food waste is both understood and responded to within those organizations. So then we have all of the different processes as they relate to food waste. And any one of these has potential to positively or negatively impact the rate of food waste within the organization. Staff, and in the research, these are predominantly representing food service staff and caregiving staff. And they all come into these organizations with their own values, their beliefs, their own experiences, and this influences how they engage with food waste within that organization. And they also require support from the organization in order to engage in food waste reduction processes at work. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Like staff, residents also come in to these facilities with their own values and beliefs and their own care needs. And these ultimately really influence the level of food waste within that aged care facility. And so then surrounding this, we've got the policy landscape. And this is really a two-way relationship. Policy influences the processes within aged care facilities, but also the aged care industry influences the shape of policy. And I will also come back to this, but policy is a key theme that came through the data set as affecting food waste within aged care. In the middle, we've got communication. And we can understand this as a vehicle that it's necessary to ensure the efficient and effective food service within the organization. And really when communication is poor, then the food waste reduction responses are negatively impacted. And then finally, you'll see technology kind of links all of the parts in there. And that is really representing the role that technology can have within organizations to help effectively manage those food service processes, improving accuracy, improving communication. So from this, what became really apparent was that the way that food waste is understood varies a lot depending on which level of the organization that you're looking at. So at an industry level, there was very little evidence within their data set that demonstrated that there was an awareness of food waste as an issue at that industry level, and no real alignment as to how it should be approached. At that organizational level, it really varied from one aged care facility to another, some with very little awareness, some with a lot of awareness. But as an average, you could say that there is a base level of awareness at that organizational level that food waste is an issue. Staff and residents were both aware of food waste as a problem. Staff in particular may have been aware that food waste was an issue, but didn't necessarily understand how they could engage in processes to reduce food waste, and didn't necessarily see that it was their responsibility to do so. On the other hand, residents found it really difficult to be seeing that food waste was happening and not having any autonomy or control over the process to reduce that food waste. So we wanted to know, well, how are these aged care facilities actually responding to food waste? And so we found evidence of a number of different responses, which are presented up on the screen here. But most commonly cited was quantification and measurement, or monitoring, sorry. And then that was followed by changes to the way that the food service was done. So we considered these on a continuum. And so on the vertical axis at the bottom, looking at organizational awareness, going from a base level through to a strategic level of awareness. And then on that horizontal, you've got an independent activity through to a response that is integrated throughout the entire organization. And so from our perspective, we really want to see responses sitting in that upper, what is that, left-hand side, where they are strategic and integrated. And as you can see, none of them have been placed up there. And I will say that that is subjective, and a number of these could sit up in that top quadrant. But the reason that they didn't, from the state of the academic literature, is that we didn't see any evidence of that organizational strategic approach to these activities. And so that's why they're sitting down that bottom part. I will say it doesn't mean that there aren't aged care organizations doing this. It just isn't captured in the literature at this point in time. So then we wondered, well, what are the factors that enable and constrain organizations to respond to food waste? And so I've got a list up here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll touch on a few. But one thing I want to point out is you'll notice there are a lot of things up there that sit on both sides. And so what this really speaks to is how it is practiced within an organization. So if we think about organizational strategy, if that organization doesn't have food waste reduction within that organizational strategy, it's really unlikely that organization is going to spend time, money, resources enabling their staff to engage in food waste reduction activities. Additionally, there's always going to be other priorities that that organization has, for instance, resident satisfaction. And if food waste isn't embedded at that strategic level, these other ones will take priority. So on the flip side, if their strategy is present, there's a much greater chance that that food waste reduction will be prioritized, it'll be resourced, and it'll be monitored over time. So aged care sits, as I said, within the healthcare sector. And as such, there's a number of policies that are designed to protect residents' health and safety and well-being. So for example, a minimum number of choices on a menu at every meal, because this gives residents autonomy to choose what they want to eat. Policy determining portion sizes to make sure that they're actually getting the appropriate nutrition and they're not going to have malnutrition. Another example is policy that prevents the reuse of food. So in many countries, any food that is served is then treated as contagious and it has to be disposed of. So aged care facilities aren't able to repurpose food or engage in food rescue in the same way that a lot of other food service sector organizations are. And so what really came out of this was that the policy comes from a really good place, but it often restricts change and it inadvertently increases the rate of food waste within aged care organizations. HR practices often have a significant influence on whether or not staff engage in food waste reduction activities. So in instances where the engagement is low, it's often also that there isn't that level of support from HR. There are a number of tools and systems that HR managers can draw on to help support their staff engage with food waste initiatives. Two of these, one would be regular, targeted, and ongoing training for staff in how to engage in the food waste practices, how to conduct a waste audit. And this is going to give the staff the tools necessary to understand why and how they are supposed to engage. Another one is job sizing. So across a lot of the studies, there was no formalization of responsibility for food waste reduction. And so staff are being asked to do this above and beyond what their job description was. If you actually embed those into their job descriptions, those staff have authority over their tasks, they're appropriately recognized for their work, it enables them to be appropriately resourced and legitimizes access to training. So to wrap up, I want to touch on some of the existing gaps and implications for policy and practice. So overall, we identified 3 key research gaps relating to study design, measurement of effectiveness of the food waste responses, and a lack of theory within the existing literature. So studies within the data set predominantly had really small sample sizes. And this is problematic when you have such a large population of older people in aged care facilities, because it affects the representativeness of the data. Also, the quantification processes varied a lot, and it meant that we couldn't compare data from one study to another because the way that it was collected had varied so significantly, which brought in questions of what is the quality of that data? Is it actually representative? I'm about out of time, so I'll just let you have a wee look up there for the rest of it. But importantly, we think that HR practices should be engaged in. There needs to be strategic oversight at an organizational level. And at an industry level, it would be really great to see aged care organizations creating baselines for measuring their food waste and also for how are we going to approach it. Thank you very much.
If we could have all of the last 4 speakers come and join us up here, that'd be fantastic. I reckon another round of applause. Appreciation. So again, really diverse, different areas, completely different approaches, some very quantitative, very qualitative, literature reviews, all different approaches and skill sets being applied to informing how we're going to create a more thriving future. So, kapai, good work. Are there any questions from the floor before I click? Oh, there we go. I don't get to be greedy and ask my own question first.
Thank you for those presentations. I have a question for Bethany. I really enjoyed how you reviewed the production emissions for the different, your comparison of electric vehicles versus non-electric. And I was just wondering if in your literature review you came across anything at the end of life cycle for those vehicles in terms of waste or battery waste, things like that.
I didn't really come across anything like that, although there is things about reusing the old EV batteries. So you can use it as energy storage for, say, if you have solar power, you can store your energy in an EV battery and get some more life out of it, because the recycling process is still pretty iffy for that. So it's an interesting way to reuse it.
And I saw some more hands coming up.
Oh yeah, I've got one for Brooke. So you were talking about, which I found really interesting, about like the storage on the train. So if you're running like an event, like a train for like a particular like concert, say like Electric Ave, do you reckon you could like try and find a way to say, just have a weekend, and then maybe that would be a smaller barrier if people aren't running it over summer?
Yeah, definitely. I think when I sat down and was sort of looking through all of my research, it became quite clear that there were some, I guess, timings that had smaller barriers than others. And I think that initial start of year timing had quite a few, just based around, I guess, rolling stock availability, as well as looking at the amount of storage and the amount of luggage people would have. But yeah, I think running it on a basis where if there were events over the year, or even for the smaller breaks home, people would definitely have a lot less to carry. So that's something that can be worked around. Yeah.
I might jump in with one as well. So this is prompted by Elena's talk at the end.
Can I ask Brooke a follow-on question there? Yeah, so just while we're on Brooke, yeah. I did a workshop with the School of Performing Arts yesterday, yeah, and they would look at their sustainability, and I didn't prompt it at all. They came up with the idea of the train as well, but what they wanted to do was have students doing performances in all of the different carriages. So it was kind of like a moving production heading up and down the railway line. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's something that came up quite a bit actually in my research, was this idea of the train as a venue and running the train as an event. And no matter what the purpose of the train originally was for, is quite a good way to think about the experience of the trip. But I reckon we could get performers all the time. Like, I think it should be a regular part of the service. It sounds like it would have a lot of benefits to that.
Cool. So organizational culture, so Elena was talking about that within aged care facilities, but to the other 3 presenters, as student researchers, you're all sort of parachuted into other organizations and going and understanding the role that their cultures play in terms of what, you know, what's possible and what isn't. I don't know if you want to comment, maybe starting with Tessa, on what you felt, you know, your personal experience of, you know, learning about organizational culture through your research journey.
Yeah, totally. I think one thing with the mobile libraries is that I just love talking to the librarians specifically when I was on the bus. They are so passionate about their jobs and they really love it. And sometimes there was a little bit of apprehension about like why I was there, which was interesting to observe. And I think as well, just like learning a lot about how, because I'm just a little student, like I don't know how the big world works a little bit. And so, yeah, just trying to, what's it called, when like not always doing like blue sky thinking and thinking about what is actually realistic in some of these places, especially when money is quite tight at the moment. So yeah, but it was overall like learning about the organizations that I worked with super valuable and interesting and a good learning experience. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I feel like for me with my research, it was more about I guess the culture of operating service like this in general. Every single person I spoke to in my research was over the moon with the idea of a train. I think everyone really loves the idea of running a service like this and can see the benefit that it would have in the community. And then it was, I guess, getting into, well, how do you actually go about creating a service and facilitating it like that, and just the culture around how initiatives like this get started and what goes into that. And I think that's been a really good learning experience for me, at least.
Yeah, so I was mainly data crunching, so I didn't really spend a lot of time talking to people. But with switching to EVs, it's such a like barrier for some people because I think maybe it causes more emissions due to those batteries, which batteries are interesting. But so yeah, trying to like show people, hey, actually for New Zealand, we would be decreasing the emissions and it's actually a pretty cool idea to go forward with. So yeah.
Hi, great student presentations, all of you. I have a question for Elena. So you mentioned at the beginning there is maybe like less waste in hospitals. And I was just wondering why that would be, and is that a strategy thing or is there a different system in that? And could that help out aged care facilities?
No, there's a huge issue with food waste in hospitals. It's significantly more studied than aged care. And hospitals are quite interesting because they span such a range from your emergency care where you might only be in the hospital for a week or a day, through to people who are critically ill and are there for weeks to months. And so there are aged care, hospitals do provide aged care, but it's just one part of a whole. And so that was one of the reasons that we excluded them from the study. But yeah, there's a huge amount of data on food waste within hospitals, and it is really significant. And in many ways, it's comparable. I guess my statement of it being one of the highest is hospitals, if you think about them, are massive organizations, whereas if you compare an aged care facility to a restaurant, those food waste levels are sort of more comparable, or to a university hall. And so that's sort of where that comment came from. But yeah, hospitals are doing a number of the same things that aged care facilities are, because there's that healthcare crossover. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying that like restaurants and uni halls are like lower than these organizations. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, Tessa. asking about, is it fair to say from your study that the city library and the book bus is not necessarily considered a great substitute for one another?
Yeah, totally. That's not quite what I was expecting. But yeah, definitely they have totally different purposes, and people come into the city library for really specific purposes. Often they want to browse the books, and me too. That's why I like going to the library, because there's lots of books and you can look around. And so I don't think that they are comparable in some ways, because they just provide such a different service. And I think that we should take it even further personally, and really turn the mobile libraries into outreach as well. So that would take them even further from like being what the city library is essentially. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I was going to ask you to comment further on that, but you have. Is there anything that mobile libraries could do though or existing services they already offer that we don't necessarily know about that could help reduce some of those trips into town? For example, can you return your library books at the mobile library?
Yeah, I think one thing that did stick out to me, I didn't talk about this in my presentation, was I also asked whether people were users of the book bus at the city library, and most of them said no, but they did know about it, which made me think that they like weren't using it for a reason. But yeah, there definitely is. And as I talked about, I had a big services list of when I was asking the library users what else they would be interested in. And some of those things could be done, like they could go and get community support information or council information. They could go and do community consultation on the bus, that kind of thing. So that could definitely reduce trips into town. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, that's
Cool.
great. Thank you.
Hey, sorry, I don't know. I feel like I'm stepping out of my role a bit here, but I've got a question for Bethany. You speak a lot about the fact that the research what you did was specifically to like how they can reduce their emissions in New Zealand. I wonder if you could speak to how much it would change like in other countries. Do you know what I mean? Like the energy sources that would contribute to that.
So in New Zealand, we're pretty lucky. We have about 80 to 85% renewable electricity in the grid. But for some other countries, like I found for I think it was Poland, and they had like about 17% renewable. So for them, electric vehicles wouldn't actually emit less than a petrol vehicle over the whole life cycle. So as long as you've got quite a bit of renewable electricity in the grid, then yes, it is a good solution to reduce emissions. But unless if you have that, it's not exactly the solution for just then.
I'd like to speak to the aged care lady. What was your name? Eleanor. Eleanor, I have a husband in aged care, and most of my friends are there too. And there is shocking waste with the food. But a suggestion perhaps would be the staff that go off on their leave could leave, like in the night staff, could leave a notice about how that patient is for the day. They'll see how they'll be, because they have beautiful food, lovely meals, but they're big. And the staff that go off at night could put on the report they're not able to eat, because they're too sick to eat that day, but the food will still arrive when they're not capable of having it. That's happened to my husband a few times, and I think, why do they bring the food, all this lovely food, when he's not capable? So I think the staff could do something to help, because it's a big waste.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't touch on it today, but that communication piece is one of the key findings in that research, is just how important it is, and how communication within the studies is really siloed within departments. And so there's not a lot of interface between, for instance, the food service staff and the caregiving staff. And so information isn't being passed, or it's often one way. So the kitchen will get an order and they create to that order, but they don't actually have access to a lot of other information about individual preferences or portion sizes. Or, for example, the policy is that this is the minimum size, and there's no flexibility within the organization to say, well, actually, this person isn't going to eat that. They need a half portion. But yeah, so throughout the whole data set, improved communication throughout the organization to meet that exact need that you're talking about was a really key
if
key
they could
theme.
do something that way. It's very difficult. Thank you.
I have a question for Brooke. Obviously it's summertime, so, and given your project is largely directed towards a student service, it would be difficult to find students to survey for that. So I was just wondering if you at all kind of recorded where the students that you were surveying were from and where they were traveling to, because I know, like for myself, I'm from Hawke's Bay, so sometimes I drive or bus up to Christchurch and then I fly from there because it's cheaper. And I'm stingy. And so I was just wondering if you recorded that sort of data to see if people were also just using it as a way to save money.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I was really lucky with my project. The Sustainability Office has already done, and the OUSA had already done a lot to look into this concept of a train. So there had already been surveys done, and actually in the referenda, the OUSA referenda, there had been questioning about a train and gauging people's opinions on it. So the students I spoke to were accessed through, they just went on the Sustainability Office Instagram page. There was a wee sign up that people could do if they were really interested to speak to me and communicate their ideas. So I did get a few students. The ones I spoke to mainly based in Christchurch. One of the students showed up with a pre-made presentation for me, and he had done his own emissions calculations. It was actually really cool, and he was saying that apparently one trip from Christchurch to Dunedin is the same emissions as burning a couch, and he suggested that we put that in the communication. So there was a lot of really cool engagement, and it was really cool to see the students come in with their own ideas and everything. Yeah, but most of the people I spoke to were between Christchurch based because they this was something that was obviously very close to them. Also, sorry not to ramble, guys, but on the topic of providing that service to students who do fly and are looking for a cheaper option, that was something that came up actually a few different times within my interviews. As yeah, I think flying out of Dunedin is quite an expensive thing, so that's an interesting point. Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder if we now have a new unit of measurement for global warming. Number of couches burned.
Hi, Brooke, asking about the train now. When you refer to support for bus services, are you talking about the train as a support for bus services, or are you talking about improving and supporting the existing bus services better? Things like an express bus service. I know how long it takes once you stop in Waikoiti, Timaru, Ashburton, it gets really tiresome.
Yeah, so I think the way I tried to frame it was this idea of an irregular service versus a regular service. So there's obviously that constant regular travel between Dunedin and Christchurch, and the train was, I guess, a way to meet when there is that higher demand. But like on the topic of supporting bus services, and I think had I had more time to spend on this research and was able to delve into it deeper, I really would have loved to expand on this. But speaking with Intercity and their understanding, like COVID has really affected their service, and also looking at like the first mile, the last mile accessibility to the service. So yeah, so I think it is creating assisting them in creating a service that students would like to use. And then there was also discussion about how it could be marketed to students. So yeah, I really would have loved to delve into it deeper.
One of the examples Brooke raised with me was just the university pick up for the intercities, no cover for the elements. So that's something that the council could pick up as responsible for bus shelters in the city. So
yeah, oh yeah, definitely. When I take the intercity, I stand outside the KFC and wait to take the bus. So I think being able to provide services to students on the side of the trip in a way that makes the experience more comfortable and they're more willing to make that switch, I think is a really good opportunity.
Thank you very much for the excellent questions. Thank you very much to the panel for your good answers and for your presentations and just for your bloody great work. So thank you very much. It's now a break for lunch. We'll meet back in here again at 1:15. And also there's the other sessions online at 1:15 again. So please have a look at your programme, figure out which ones you want to be in, come in, grab a seat. Let's make sure we fill from the front so that we can be nice and close to the speakers. Ka kite anō.